Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are tuning in from. We're so excited to see you all here at our Your Journey Now I Know from Diverse Leaders event, where we're going to hear from a group of really awesome panelists, a group of alums of the GSB. My name is Jessica Chung. I'm an admissions officer at the Stanford Graduate School of Business. And I'm just really grateful that you are spending a little bit of your day with us today. So I want to start by going over what today's event will look like. We'll start with a brief introduction to our community. We're going to introduce our panelists. I have a few prepared questions for them just to get us warmed up. And in the meantime, please submit your own questions in the Q&A box. You can feel free to get a little practice in that Q&A box and let us know your name and where you're tuning in from. We always love seeing who's in the Zoom room with us. And then we'll turn to your questions in the Q&A box. You can also use the upvoting feature if you see somebody has submitted a question that really resonates with you, and that way we can try to address some of the most pressing questions for the group. Overall, we're going to spend about 55 minutes together with the goal of introducing you all to our GSB community, to leaders who have come from our community and represent all different experiences and backgrounds. I'm going to take a look in the Q&A box just because I am curious about who's in the Zoom room with us today. Hello, Frank from Providence, Rhode Island, Paula from Colombia, Nicole from Miami, Mike from California. Hello, Gwen from Atlanta, Pooja from San Francisco, Nate from Florida, Gray from Spain, Stacy from Canada, Nana from Malaysia. Wow, it's so good to see you all. And it's awesome because in some ways this is like it's like a microcosm of what it's like to be at the GSB, where our community really comes from all over the country and all over the world. So this is very exciting for us to see where you all are tuning in from today. So a little bit about our community, and then I think you'll get a much deeper sense of what our community is like over the course of today's panel. Our community includes over 30,000 alumni who are all over the country and all over the world. We have 60 volunteer-led regional chapters of alumni around the world. So it's truly a community for life. And on our campus, we have a variety of student organizations, women's programs, diversity programs. There are many different ways to engage on our community, both as a student and as an alum. Next, I would like to turn it over to our panelists to introduce themselves, going in alphabetical order. Adriana, you want to kick us off?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Really happy to be here. I'm Adriana Peon. I'm class of 2012. My background is in undergrad. I went to NYU. I have a double major in psychology and sociology. I worked at PepsiCo in Mexico before the GSB. After the GSB, like now I'm in tech and I'm working for Facebook, but I've had a journey of like I did management consulting, fintech, and now I'm in advertising. So really happy to be here.
Awesome, thank you. Alejandro, would you like to introduce yourself?
Everyone, I'm Alejandro Aguirre, class of 2019. So my background, I studied mechanical engineering at MIT. Spent a few years after undergrad in Boston, worked at Liberty Mutual Insurance doing data analytics work. When I was looking for roles at GSB, I was focused on startup recruiting. So I ended up actually using the GSB alumni network to land an internship and my first role out of GSB. And now I'm currently working at an early stage startup called Workwhile that is building a labor marketplace to help hourly workers find jobs.
Awesome, thank you. And Jessica?
And I'm Jessica, Alejandro's classmate. I went to Howard for undergrad, and before the GSB, I worked in private equity and then in the food space. And then after the GSB, I actually went into venture, and now I'm back in private equity. So I've also covered quite a realm of different industries and ended up starting my own private equity firm, which is the Century Partners.
Awesome, thank you all so much. One of our panelists has not yet joined us, which is totally fine. Hopefully she'll be able to join us later in the session. Before we dive into the session, I do want to note that this is hopefully just one stop along your journey. You can continue your journey if you haven't already at mystanford.mba, where you can create a personalized dashboard to keep track of your application, browse different parts of student life and academic life at the GSB, and learn more about our events and stay in touch with us. So with that, I'm going to stop screen share. And I do have a few prepared questions for our panelists. As I said, for our attendees, please feel free to submit your questions in the Q&A box. We love to hear what you want to learn about today. So my first question for our panelists is, why did you decide to pursue an MBA, and why did you decide to pursue an MBA at Stanford specifically?
I can go first. I think the reasons why I wanted to pursue is different than what happened later. So I was in Mexico. I studied in the US, came back to Mexico, and I was a psychology major working on business process reengineering. And so what I thought I needed, or why I thought I needed an MBA, is I had fundamental gaps around business. And I think going into it, what I learned was it was a lot more about a journey of personal and professional transformation, but very focused on personal transformation, on how I can be a better leader. What are the tools that you can actually use as you grow and mature into organizations? And what was the second question? Sorry.
Why a Stanford MBA?
And why Stanford? Because of that part. I was really keen. I had a really strong psychology background, and I was really keen on human development. And now I think with design thinking and touchy-feely, like it's become a lot more popular across other schools. But at that time, it was explicitly at Stanford, and I think it's the best place, honestly, to learn about that. And that Stanford is a place where vulnerability is expected. And that's really uncomfortable. And I am just really glad I went to the GSB, and it was a hugely transformational process for me.
Absolutely. And for, I think a lot of our audience members might be familiar with interpersonal dynamics, which our alums often call touchy-feely, but can you say a little bit about what that class is?
Yeah. So it's a class where you understand how your actions and your words can impact the other person, and how to make sure you create deep connections. Actually, there's a new book that's highly recommended. It's Connecting. You're gonna know the name better than me, but I read it on Carol Robbins, had the book. Like I can just go, like, personally, I'm part of the LGBT community. I was not out. It was a time where in Mexico it was very complicated. And through the GSB, I gained the security and the safety among my classmates to actually come out. And that, I think that's a process of transformation that was really critical on accepting myself as a true and authentic leader, and that I have carried through my career.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that with us.
The YMBA piece for me was connected to realizing that the growth of my career was not based on just hard work, but also networks. So it was when I looked at the opportunities to do an MBA, I could not do an MBA and work really hard at finding other connections and connections outside of like my industry and where I was in New York, or I could use an MBA as like a catalyst for growth to meet people that I never would have like met, and would have been very difficult to try to arrange like an international cohort, cross-industry, cross-country of people. And so I recognize that as having a lot of value after a couple of years outside of work. And I would say, like, I mean, hopefully it's not surprising. My Stanford MBA delivered on that maybe 100-fold. I think I was a little bit, maybe pessimistic isn't the word, but realistic about what the MBA could give me. Everyone's like, this is going to be a life-changing experience, and you're gonna, come out of it like some supercharged person. So I was just a little bit realistic about what it could mean for me. But in reality, I would say that and you don't really call it a network. It's, your friends, like people that people that care about you, and not just outside of my class, but my class professors, like other people who are just randomly, contacted as a result of the experience is truly just like so meaningful to like where I am today. And why I chose Stanford was really, it's kind of really cheesy, but it's really in the DNA of what it means. And it's just like, you know, clearly stated in the byline of change lives, change organizations, change the world. And just like an intent across my classmates and an intent across the broader GSB community, I think to think substantively about the world that we want to create and that we want to see. And not to say that everyone agrees on what that looks like, but we all agree that there has to be like change and we have to put in the work to make a better like world for like not only us, but future generations. So I felt like that really underpinned what people thought about or how they like moved through the world. And I really appreciated that. And that's why I chose Stanford, even though I applied to 7 or 8 schools.
Yeah, so the why MBA for me is I think a couple years after undergrad, I was gonna hit like a fork in the road of like what it was that I thought I wanted to pursue. I was in a data analyst position, so basically I was either gonna go do like a data science program, a PhD in stats, or do like an MBA. My boss and like mentor at the time was a business school grad, and so that's when I started to kind of understand what could come from that type of skill set, like what you can develop there. I think personally, I had always been more focused heads down on like the technical work and not really considering kind of the network, the power of like relationships within business context. So that's I think something that was appealing for me. And honestly, even more than that was the like optionality of like having 2 years to explore and learn a lot about like what actually, excites me, which honestly like was the biggest value out of the GSB or just an MBA in general. And the why Stanford specifically, I think there's probably like 3 specific things that come to mind. So one is wanting to dive into like startup ecosystem. I'd come from working at 2 very, very large companies prior to the GSB. So startup kind of ecosystem community was very foreign to me. I didn't really know anything about it. So I wanted to like basically dive headfirst into that. The second was kind of like the whole touchy-feely culture of the GSB, not just the class, but just the idea that what that class represents is kind of embedded into lots of other aspects of the GSB. And I got that from like speaking to alums, students, and like admissions officers at the time when I was searching for it. They made it very clear that this was an opportunity to develop personally, not just professionally, which honestly ended up being like the reason why I decided to go to Stanford. And the final choice is that I'm from Los Angeles and I was tired of being on the East Coast and wanted to come back to California.
Awesome. Thank you all for sharing those reflections. I feel like each of you touched on sort of the distinctive GSB community in different ways and this like shared culture of vulnerability, authenticity, and we sort of call it principled leadership, like people-centric leadership. Are there any, when you think back on your time at the GSB, are there any favorite memories or favorite moments that you feel really capture the essence of the GSB community and GSB family for you?
Well, the highlight, which is what most people get to experience once you get accepted or come for the weekend, is talk. And they might do this at other opportunities or other junctures, but I think that there's not one particular talk, but it's over every week where people are sharing their story and being very vulnerable and open about whatever it is. It doesn't have to be some kind of crazy overcome some huge mountain type of story, but it's really that ethos of like who they are and like what matters to them. I always think of it as an extension of like the what matters most to you and why question that is traditionally has been one of the essays. I don't know if it's an essay anymore, but anyway.
It is.
Application essay questions. And so it's great to get a window into people. And I think what comes out of that is the vulnerability piece that we mentioned. It's the connection to people and realizing that everyone, is their own little iceberg. There's just so much like underneath that you don't traditionally get to see, but it's really cool to break that down, and people that you're close to, people that you don't really know, just getting to share that common knowledge and experience and be able to distill that. And I think therefore understand just people and humanity better, taking home those stories and remembering them is definitely one of the big moments that I really cherish and still remember many of those talks.
I think, of course, for me, giving my talk, and that's when I came out, was a big moment. And I did it in a trip. So that's the other thing I'm going to mention. I was very focused on social innovation. So and the GSB has a mandatory trip, well, I don't know with COVID, but a mandatory trip abroad. It can be their business trip or a social focus trip. And I actually took 4. So I went to India. That's in a mini talk where I came out to my friends. I went to India on healthcare, South Africa on education, Kenya on social entrepreneurship, and then I did a nonprofit trip, non-official, to Burundi, Rwanda, and Uganda. And I think those trips are just amazing. The people you get to have conversations with, the expansion of a global perspective, and the friendships that you develop from those trips is just amazing.
Yeah, I'll kind of emphasize the talk bit as well. Definitely like hearing other people's stories, but then going through the process of like the reflection that was kind of like a repeat of the what matters most to you and why reflection process. It was just doubling down and doing it a bit more. At least that was the case for me. Yeah. And I think going through, I think I spent the first like year or so like not kind of I would say sharing all aspects of like my family background and like life, etc. And so obviously like that's not a great way to start out an experience, but I think the talk process kind of helped me open up more. And I think it helped me realize that like, you know, some of the reasons that I was maybe holding back were not really warranted, and that it was like to my benefit and to others' benefit to be more transparent about that. You know, related to that, my second year, myself and a couple of my classmates, we helped start the like first generation low income diversity group at the GSB. And I mean, I think the thing that I took away from that is like how many conversations I had with people about those things, not just in my class, but in the class below me as well, of just like learning things about others that otherwise, you know, I would not have learned if I had not like put myself out there in a certain way. So I think that's something that I've taken away and like continue to think about a lot. And obviously we'll certainly have like continue to have an impact in the way that I interact with other people.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. And I feel like you bring up something that I'm really curious to learn more about is how did your GSB experience impact the way you think about the role of identity and diversity in leadership? I mean, this panel is all about diverse leaders, and I'm curious how your perspectives on that evolved because of your GSB experience.
I could start. I mean, for me, it changed me completely. And I think it took me a while to find an organization to work for where my values were aligned in the way I learned to be, and I learned to be myself at the GSB. So it took me a while to get to a place like Facebook. I was interim country director for Facebook Mexico, and I was interim country director for when COVID hit. So I was in charge of managing the COVID crisis. And what we saw and the role that I had to take as a leader was one of authenticity and vulnerability. We did not have the answers. And I was actually in charge of helping a lot of Mexico CEOs and a lot of our clients and advertisers walk through that journey of showing up authentically, showing up with vulnerability. We had, I mean, and we still do have people struggling with health, mental health issues and whatnot. And yes, we are driving for performance, but caring of the individual as a whole has been paramount to all of the efforts that we've been doing, and that I learned at the GSB. Like I couldn't have done that without the tools that I learned at the GSB.
I think prior to going to attend at the GSB, I think my identity as like being Latino, being like first gen was not really top of mind. Honestly, it took a back seat to a lot of other things for most of like undergrad and my professional career before the MBA. But arriving at Stanford, and I think, you know, and you'd see this in any kind of top business school, just seeing that diversity isn't really where it ought to be. I think that kind of helped me figure out, I realized like how important that was to me and how much time I personally wanted to dedicate to those issues like that. So I don't know specifically how it's influenced kind of like my own personal like leadership style, but it certainly has influenced what I choose to invest my time in, and what it is that I feel like strong conviction around making sure that I like raise my voice in. So I mean, in addition to the first gen low income stuff, I was co-president for the Hispanic Business Student Association while at Stanford. But I also kind of the idea of like helping underserved communities was always like kind of like a common theme in my own personal career search. And I've been pretty fortunate that I've been able to land somewhere where I feel like my job is consistent with those values, even though I am working at a VC-backed startup. You know, I think it's pretty rare that someone can say that. So I don't know. I think that it's the perspective I got from Stanford through that kind of fueled my career search, but also kind of the way I look at the world, and you know how I want to kind of operate within it.
100% on that, Alejandro. Like I couldn't have said that even better. I was trying to think of like an eloquent way to like state that, but I think my experience at the GSB was one that magnified my ability to realize like, oh my gosh, like I'm a Black woman, and like there's so much here that we have to continue to press for and work toward if like if I want to see like more of me at this school, in society. And I'm using more of me, but I mean just like professional women, professional Black people like at the table. And I have like a strong positioning in doing that. And so that's what really I think kind of changed my catalyst of my career, was thinking about, oh, the opportunity as a capital allocator to be able to pour money into underserved communities as a way of being able to back underserved individuals, and that being a catalyst into the trickle down effect of who is employed and who is making money. And so just really changed my mindset in terms of like my positioning and the work that I want to do, and like how I want to serve communities. And so now in my work, I'm specifically focused on how can I invest in thinking about diversity as a value enhancer. So not just in not a concessionary return type of thing, but to say like diversity is the thing that's here to stay. And I think that there's a real value in that. And so how do I back diverse owned companies? How do I put diverse people into leadership positions and governance positions? And then think about the underlying societies that they're serving. So yeah, it was a huge push and change of direction for me.
Awesome. Thank you all for sharing those reflections. And I feel like you all bring up something that is that I want to acknowledge. You know, we're not a perfect institution. We have work to do when it comes to diversity and to representation and to inclusion. We're not perfect, and that's something that I think many of my colleagues would transparently say. One thing that I have admired during my time at Stanford so far is that there's, I think, institutionally a will to change and a responsiveness to students. For example, last summer, as a response to the uprisings against murders of Black folks by police forces, Stanford GSB launched the Action Plan for Racial Equity, and it's something that we're trying to hold ourselves accountable to. In the admissions office, we are building out partnerships with organizations that support folks from underrepresented or historically excluded backgrounds, such as Forte and Management Leadership for Tomorrow. So we're not a perfect institution by any means, but we are working to be better. And that's something that I do admire about our community and our institution. And I want to thank our panelists for their transparency around that, because I think ultimately that's the purpose of these panels, is to tell the truth and study at the GSB. So I appreciate that from you all as well. So I'm turning to our Q&A box. And there are a couple questions. I'm going to see if I can kind of group them. Well, there are a couple of questions about sort of transitions and the ways that the GSB might have changed you or changed your path. So for example, Charles asks, how has your what matters most changed during and after Stanford, if at all? I think is such an interesting question. So I can say that again. How has your what matters most changed during and after Stanford, if at all?
It's a constant for me. I think I just mostly wrote about like my family and the legacy I feel like I'm creating and have the like opportunity or to take part of. But yeah, it's like what it boils down to is like my family and how much they like mean to me and how much it matters. And so that's a constant. It's like my number one like most important thing, value or whatever. So hopefully that won't change.
Yeah, my what matters most to me and why when I wrote my essay was basically being a role model to younger generation and underserved communities. When I wrote that, I had in mind basically like my nephews, like other kids growing up in my neighborhood. I don't think it's changed too much. I think the way that I would kind of reframe it is like being a change agent to support those individuals now. I think that's more top of mind now than it was before the GSB.
And I think, I mean, you're listening to Alejandra and Jessica. If you really write it right, it doesn't change, right? And more than changing, for me, it's been a North Star. When I left the GSB, I joined consulting in the Bay Area. And when I read it, I was miserable in the role. And it took me like one night of reading it and knowing that I needed to transition, that all of the things that I had built and what I wanted to do and what was my mission was not getting fulfilled there. And so that's the reason why I decided to go back to Mexico and then look for opportunities where I could have the impact I was wanted to have, which was part of my whole what matters most to you and why. And so I think it's more of a North Star, and it might change in tones and whatever, but it is, if it's written correctly, it should not change.
I love that. And I feel like I hear that so often from our students and from our alums about going through the application process, that often the very first step is reflecting, going through that process of introspection to really, really figure out where you are, where you want to go with your career, what matters most to you and why. And I feel like you capture that really, really perfectly. Sort of on the, I think if what matters most to you and why is on the personal side, on the more professional side, we do have a couple of questions too about career pivots. Nate says, I noticed Adriana and Alejandra transitioned into the tech industry. Could you share a specific experience like a class, club, internship, et cetera, at Stanford that had the largest impact to prepare you for your current roles? So I think that's a question that all of you could respond to. What's a class, club, internship that had the largest impact on you and prepared you for your current role? Especially if you were pivoting, which I believe actually all three of you were pivoting into different industries. So yeah, we'll start there.
I can start. So for me, when I was coming into the GSB, I had kind of this idea that I wanted to work in autonomous vehicle technology. That was largely informed by coming from the insurance industry and just wanting some way of transitioning into tech. That eventually kind of evolved and turned into labor marketplaces for underserved communities, specifically low-wage workers. I think the specific classes that helped me get there, it wasn't like a linear path, but that helped me get there was, one was Startup Garage, which I'm sure many viewers are familiar with like kind of the content that's on the Stanford website. And the other was Data and Decisions, which is pretty random. I don't think many people would attribute any kind of like career pivot from that class, but I did get to work on a project with a startup that was a marketplace. And that was the very first time I'd ever kind of had firsthand exposure with that type of business model. And that kind of got me really excited. And I ended up kind of wanting to go in that direction.
I can talk a little bit about mine. I ended up in tech by accident. My career has not been as planned as other people's, but I think when you think about like, and I'll talk about international and like I've worked in the US, I worked in Mexico, and I'm back in the US now. And I think that gives you also the very different perspective. So when I moved back to Mexico, what I wanted to do is maximize impact and working to generate economic empowerment in the country. And so tech was an easy choice in that regard, because when I was offered a job at PayPal, it was to manage SMBs and empowering digital payments for SMBs, and you can see the chain of impact. So I didn't join because it was tech. I joined because it was the most scalable way to have impact, and I joined in a commercial function where it is, if particularly for those who want to do tech abroad, mostly outside of London, Switzerland, Tel Aviv, and maybe a little bit in Singapore, most of the tech roles tend to be commercial. And so you develop a really strong commercial acumen. And so that's coming back to the US. I'm more focused on learning about product, which I haven't learned in my career, but expanding that product component to my skill set that is mostly commercial, and I'm in the partnerships team. I think classes specifically, it's hard. I mean, of course, you're going to have to use data and whatnot, but for me, there's two critical classes. One is, and I don't know if they still exist, I'm out almost 10 years now. It's CAT, critical analytical thinking. The biggest gap we see in talent, particularly in emerging markets, is critical analytical thinking when it comes to tech. Data is now pervasive, and it's how you use the data, how you question, and how do you do hypotheses and hypothesis testing. That's really important. And the other one is Joel Peterson's Managing Growing Enterprises. That is, I use it every day. It's like, as a people leader and as a people manager, the cases that you review and the skill sets that you develop on people, literally, there's not a day where I don't put some of that in practice.
Yeah, now this is taking on a couple of different things. I would say two things in terms of like career switching. One thing that was really catalytic for me, and maybe it is inherent in my approach, is really the people. When I came to GSB, I explored a lot of different careers by just talking to people, just like messaging. I would have this goal, and it's a very planner type thing, but like reach out to like 3 people every week related to like whatever I was pursuing. And while I was at the GSB, I explored a lot of like different ideas about things that I would enjoy. And so it like focused on cornering that like industry or sub-industry to learn about it. So that was one way. And actually what became a catalyst for my career was one of my professors just taking an interest in me. But I took an interest first in this professor. Like I was very forthcoming about building relationships, not only with like the my peers, but also like the faculty and professors. And so one of the professors was very catalytic in like helping me to like think through and get some exposure in venture, which led me to working at Andreessen Horowitz after business school, or actually while in business school and after business school. And I would say on the kind of like classes that were formative, would definitely double click on managing growing enterprises. I took it with Graham Weaver, and it was definitely something I like go back and think about and actually reference some of the materials there. Negotiations class was very like helpful. It's a mended class, but just really helpful in thinking about doing better at negotiating and actually negotiating. I never negotiated for my career prior to the GSB. And I think it's especially a downfall of diverse people, especially people of color and women. There was another class, Acting with Power, specifically playing up or playing down certain elements to just do a better job at like showing up. We can't all show up the same way every day to achieve our goals. And just so how do we think about our approach and use some kind of acting techniques in which to do it. And I could probably rattle on, but those are just a couple that really stood out for me.
Awesome. Thank you all so much for those insights. Let me see. Rashmi asked a question that I'm curious about as well. Rashmi asked, what surprised you the most about the GSB once you started the program? And I'm also curious, were there any, not just surprises, but any preconceptions you had about the GSB or myths that were debunked or confirmed once you arrived on campus?
I'd say the MBA itself, and I actually can't speak to other experiences, but someone told me in my internship before the GSB that like they remember specifically having a meeting with them, and they're like, your experience is going to go like this, like this, like this. And I was like, okay, I really don't know what that means. Like, you're going to classes, like I've been to undergrad, like, you know, I've studied before, so I'm not really sure what the like this is. But it was actually a perfect description of like, I think what I experienced. Just being in a place, taking yourself away from generally close like family and friends and being in a different environment. I think where your goal is to grow is very difficult and just hard sometimes, which like led to like multiple like crying sessions. And it was never necessarily anything dire, but I think that personal growth really does take some time and take some, you know, energy like ups and downs to kind of get there. And I think that that was probably one of the most like catalyst things. Whenever any experience like substantive challenge, I've always come out of it and been a much better person. And so I was definitely surprised by that because I thought I would like grow and be academically smarter and come out with like more friends, but didn't think about actually the journey being something that would be sometimes arduous.
For me, I think there's so many things that surprise you, and completely agree with Jessica. But then again, being very sensitive to the context, the amount of traveling, when you're not from North America, you think you're global. Like you think like, oh, we're not like North America centric. I have a global perspective, and I really did not have a global perspective. Like the world really opened up for me in that way, and the cultures that I was able to know and experience, and just through classmates and traveling, I think it was an amazing experience. On the negative side, and speaking on the nature of the GSB and how we work on changing things, I like had barely come out in Mexico, and I was like, I'm coming to the Bay Area. This is like Rainbow Town, and lo and behold, when I joined, there was only one lesbian in the two classes openly. And so I was in shock. I just couldn't believe that. And we did a lot of work on this. And I think that's where you see the GSB's commitment on how to do that and how to make sure and it was also a different type, because if you look back at the classes now, I think there's like 10, but it's how you get people to be comfortable with who they are as they progress. I think also it's not the same, like being a woman, you're already a minority, being a lesbian, like intersectionality matters. And that's what we saw, and that's what we analyzed, and how we work towards being more present in Stanford MBA, like having more female presence, because it was mostly a male presence. And I know there was a lot of investment in that area, but that was something that I was very shocked when I got there, coming from Mexico, particularly.
Yeah, for me, I think on the travel piece, like obviously I had heard from like friends and like what the travel culture was like at most MBA programs. It was definitely ended up being a lot more than I anticipated. I think before the GSB, I'd been to like 2 countries outside of the US, and then by the end of it, I'd been to 13. So like obviously it's like, you know, that's something that I chose to like take advantage of. So I think that's definitely a positive. The thing that I think I didn't see coming and that I need to adjust to is kind of like what Jessica was describing around like the waves of just things hitting you. And there's just a lot of momentum as soon as you arrive on campus, that if you're not taking the time to like stop and be intentional about which way kind of you're pointing, you can easily get swept up in whatever is kind of happening on campus, right? Like whether that be like social events or the, you know, outings, traveling, or what the extracurricular activities that seem the most fun, right? I think there were definitely plenty of times where I had to like stop and reflect, kind of similar to like the reflection I had done before the GSB, just to make sure that I was kind of doing the things that were in line with what I wanted to achieve long term. And I thought I was good at time management, but I realized I needed to get better while I was at school, while I was in school.
Thank you all for those responses. I'm curious, you all mentioned different sort of challenges that you encountered at the GSB. I'm wondering, how did you challenges? What were the resources or support systems that you drew upon to weather those challenges?
I mean, I think there's a myriad of resources. So for me, I joined the diversity board. And what's great to see there, and listening both to Alex and Jessica, is how that evolves, right? Because people were saying like, were you addressing the racial injustice issue? Well, it wasn't in a stage where we were aware we were addressing the issues that were current at that time, and they were pressing issues. And so you can see how having that active leadership and having a body that can support that is so meaningful and so important for transformation, not only of us, but of the school culture and the school principles and whatnot. I think classmates, like, it takes a while. Like, I've been out for 10 years almost, but it takes a while for people to start opening up about how they're struggling. But once they do, it's like collective catharsis. And so you have a lot of support groups, and you also have, like, I don't know, they call us poets when you're not from a quant background. And I remember we had the Dead Poet Society in winter quarter, which also changed because all of the quant classes were in one quarter and it was winter quarter. But we all got together. We had extra classes by TAs, even the professors would engage to make sure that we felt supported as we navigated those academic challenges. So I think for everything, there, like, the GSB has it's just amazing. Like, there's a resource, or you can get funding, or there's like friends, anything. It's multidimensional how you get support as you're facing these challenges.
So many resources, like, is all I can say. Same thing as Adriana. Like, I mean, just broadly, I'll just like talk about the resources, not necessarily related to those challenges, but like I use a communications coach while I was there. I went to the Career Resource Center, I don't know how many times, just like chatting with the people there about opportunities and where I saw myself as I was exploring opportunities. There's like our academic advisor for our section, who like I loved and saw a couple of times. And then there's just like resources that are just outside of the GSB, beyond the people that are there, which I think Adriana already mentioned, like your peers. Also, there's tutoring. I definitely needed a tutor for some of the classes. And so it's like peer tutors. So that was super helpful. And then just outside the GSB, a number of people in my class are very open about seeing some of the, why am I losing my train of thought? But basically seeing some of the facilitators related to like psychological or any type of like mental health care things. There's like a great resource like belonging to that, and there's like no stigma attached to it. I feel like almost half the people I know went to that center, and I forget the name of it. And there's just like resources like abound on, I agree, on whatever you need. There's that. And then the second year I found like a meditation center on campus. I would go to the meditation center and just like take the time to like breathe. So anyway, there's more resources than you'll have the opportunity to use.
Yeah, I would agree with definitely the career support. I think that was like pretty important for me since I was doing like startup recruiting. There was no kind of structured way of recruiting for that. And kind of related to that, I think like the alumni network was huge. I got 2 internships during while I was at GSB, one for the summer and then one during second year. Both were through Alumni Network Connects from like cold outreach and like basically getting the ball moving that way. So those are huge. And I would also agree with Jessica on the Stanford-wide resources when it comes to like mental health. I personally took advantage of like the therapy and mental health services that were offered there, and that was made a big difference for me while I was going through the business school program. And again, like I know many of my peers took advantage of those resources as well, and they were also folks that were very like forthcoming with that. And yeah, there definitely is no stigma. There's a lot of acceptance around like you got to do what you got to do to take care of yourself, and I think people are openly and kind of like willing there to be supportive of you, or whatever that means.
Appreciate all of those insights. There's a great question from Mike Sauce, or Mike, who asks, what sets the GSB apart from other schools with regards to diversity and inclusion? I'll give you all a second to think about that and repeat the question. What sets the GSB apart from other schools, or what's distinctive about the GSB with respect to diversity and inclusion?
I think we're all struggling a bit because it's like hard to say because we didn't go to those schools, and we're super cognizant of the fact that like we didn't. So it's like it would only be by what other people have told me. I would say what I think is distinctive is what I start off by saying, which is like a real intent to do things differently and change and to listen and be like open and honest and have real conversations with one another. That could happen in other places, I don't know, but I think it's like what underlies the culture of Stanford that creates these true conversations where we can be real with one another about like, this made me feel this way, and also just the tools. We're actually given the tools through interpersonal dynamics, you know, i.e. touchy-feely, to be able to have real conversations, to lean into what's uncomfortable and to, yeah, just dig into what would generally be taboo conversations. So I would say that of the experience, but yeah, I can't holistically speak to what other universities are doing or what it's like. Just the culture of the GSB is what resonates most for me.
Yeah, for me, similar. I didn't go to other schools, but I can tell you that the spirit and that fight for making the world a better place continues. So I'm class of 2012, and with all the social unrest in the US last year, my class got together, and we actually have not only a WhatsApp working group where we share resources, and I'm sad Nori was not here because she's part of that group, but basically we have a lot of heads up people, which is amazing, because then we get together every quarter since it's been like a year and a half now, and we discuss what are the practices that we're establishing in our own companies, how we can share those to make sure that we create a better and more inclusive place in where we're working. And that just talks about the spirit of the GSB and the people who are at the GSB and people who really just have a mindset of how do we create a better and more inclusive place for everyone.
Yeah, and I'll just reiterate what Jessica said. Like, I have no idea what other programs are like. I assume they're like similar, but I think what I observed at the GSB from being there from like beginning of first year, where I was kind of plugged into diversity initiatives, being on like HBSA board, like I was very kind of plugged in and aware of like what the broader administration was doing, and you know, it's not perfect, but what I have seen is like a lot of like progress and a lot of like willingness to like understand what it is that students need, and alumni need, in order to like improve that. So I think most recently the GSB was working through like a racial equity task force that I participated in, that basically brought together alumni from across many different generations to talk about a lot of these issues that were top of mind for students and alums and the rest of our community. And basically with the intention of figuring out what actions the GSB needed to take. To my knowledge, I haven't heard of other programs doing that or having similar initiatives. So I think to me that kind of speaks volumes of what the GSB is willing to do, at least in terms of listening to start considering kind of plans for improving diversity.
Awesome. Thank you all for those insights. I feel like you've each touched on the sort of mission orientation of Stanford GSB and of the community. And we have a few questions about social innovation opportunities and resources at the GSB, or about opportunities and support for pursuing careers that are maybe a little bit sort of quote unquote off the beaten path, that might be in social innovation or nonprofit or education, or that explore or fulfill some of those goals around serving underrepresented or under-resourced communities. Could you all speak a little bit to opportunities, resources in social innovation or social impact at the GSB?
I didn't do a good job at taking advantage of all the resources, but I think like my approach to social impact was just like, it should just be a part of the DNA. So I ended up taking away a certificate because I took so many classes on social impact because they're just like that interesting to me. That was never the goal. There are many different resources like that are focused on impact investing. There's a social innovation club. You'll find a lot of those different like interests like fulfilled, and a lot of people that share those interests on campus just through kind of formal aggregating bodies. And I'd say if you want to just do something different, Stanford is a great place to be, even if you're feel like, oh, this is like a one of one thing. I was initially came in thinking that I wanted to do like a food startup, and in terms of food and beverage, there weren't a lot of us that represented in that group, but like I think therein lies the opportunity. Like the alumni group is so large, and the community is really large to be able to fulfill that. So what I advise is just doing what I said earlier, just making sure that you get out there and start talking to people and ask people like, do you know someone in this industry? Moreover, something I advise to all of the people that I talk to that are headed to business school or going soon is like, what do you want your brand to be when you arrive on campus? What's your like one-liner? What do you want to be known for? Because that's going to stick with you. And if people know you as like the woman who's interested in social innovation in East Africa, those opportunities will magnetize to you, but you need to be able to communicate what that is to people, if that makes sense. And so if you say that a bunch of times and you say that to your class of 400, you're going to get a lot of opportunity, because within the community, people, their intent is to help, and they're going to want to see you be successful. So I would think about that wherever you go, wherever you end up, just like, what's your tagline? And, you know, how do you start to kind of magnetize those opportunities?
I also had the certificate. One resource I add is the D-School. I took a bunch of classes at the D-School, design, the famous one. I don't remember the name, the famous one, but then I also had design for education. I had a bunch of classes around different social issues. What has been interesting for me 10 years out, with all of my friends who were interested and all of us who were taking the social innovation and social impact classes, is how our careers have shifted. And so some of us think of our impact in a different way. So the way I think about it at Facebook is we're enabling connectivity, we're enabling opportunity. I serve the SBG segment again in my new role. And so what we can do is different. And then you see some of my friends who, I don't know, were in impact investing before, then went full on corporate and are now in a corporate environment, but in East Africa, for example. And so it's taking different ways and not necessarily doing like for-profit mission-driven companies. And that's, I think, how amazing it is on my perspective for social impact was just broadened by the resources and the friendships that I formed and the purview that I was able to shape at the GSB.
I actually didn't kind of pursue many of the social innovation coursework. I think the classes I ended up choosing were more focused on, I guess, like traditional like startup ecosystem work. But the one thing I will say that is probably relevant to this is while you're a student, reaching out to folks outside of the GSB network, just like folks that are working in an area that you're interested in, whether it be like specific innovation space, social impact type role, even if they're not GSB affiliated, while you're at Stanford, kind of hearing from students, specifically GSB, like business school students, is actually really, you're very likely to get a response. So like use the time that while you're in school to like reach out and like network with those individuals that are in your kind of area of career interest, because you'll actually end up being able to connect with a lot more folks then than if you kind of wait until after you're done with school. That's just my personal experience from networking for startups and other kind of related areas.
So I know we are coming up on time. For our attendees, you'll see that we have a poll. We want to know how we're doing. Ultimately, our events are all about serving you. So we want to know if we're doing a good job, and we take your feedback very, very seriously. With our last minute, there is one last question, and I'll ask our panelists to be brief in their responses if they could. But I love this question. There's a question asking, when you think back about your experience at Stanford, what are you most grateful for? So this will be a lightning round. What are you most grateful for when you think back about your experience at Stanford?
The people.
+1 on that.
Yeah.
That was a layup. Thank you.
Well, thank you all so much for spending a bit of your day with us. And thank you to our incredible panelists for sharing your stories and sharing your experiences with us and with all of our attendees tonight. I hope you all have a great rest of your day. And if you have any other questions, please feel free to get in touch with us. We are here to serve you, and we're 100% in your corner. So thank you again to our attendees, and thank you so much again to our amazing panelists. Have a good night.